Thank you very much for having me. I'm very delighted to be here, just as I thought I would be, because when I received the invitation to talk today here at this conference, I said yes to it right away, because I've never been to Denmark before, never been to Copenhagen, but I always wanted, because I always had the feeling that the Danish people and the Scandinavian people in general are the most friendliest, the best educated, and the most relaxed people you can find on the European continent. Also, as a German, I'm familiar with the behavior of the Danish people during the occupation by the German Wehrmacht, and I'm especially familiar with the behavior and the attitude of the Danish people vis-à-vis the Holocaust. And I think as a German, I can say that you should be proud of your ancestors. They have behaved very well under very difficult circumstances. Now, before I begin my presentation, I want to say a few things. First of all, please don't take anything that I say today at face value, but make use of the sources that I provide you with in order to make up your own minds. In particular, I would like to encourage you to read what I have written about today's subject at Asia Times Online in Hong Kong. Now, it should work. Yeah, okay, we're already there. You can find those items under the headlines: Insider Trading 9/11, the facts laid bare; Insight into the 9/11 debate, economists are scared. This is an interview that I did with the economist Paul Zaremka from the US, who is specialized in econometrics, and we will talk about econometrics today. And then 9/11 currency joins insider trading claims. There you will find a lot of the sources that I use, not all of them, but many. Moreover, the PowerPoint presentation that I use today will be made publicly available alongside with the video recording of this presentation. Furthermore, I want to point out that I do not consider myself personally as being part of the so-called 9/11 truth movement. I have some highly critical views on that movement, and most of the things that they are focusing on, I have very little use of that, if anything, if any at all. I am a financial journalist, and as such, I'm not sitting here as an activist for 9/11 truth. 9/11 is only a small part of my work, although right now it is a big part of my work, because I'm in the process of writing a book in German on 9/11, basically the geopolitical, technological, economical, and financial aspects of those attacks. However, when I'm done with that book, the chapter 9/11 will be closed for me forever, and I will not come back, because I'm actually pretty much sick and tired of the topic. Then, as a very final point before I begin, I want to say that I want to dedicate the following presentation to the memory of Michael C. Rupert, who has committed suicide earlier this year. Mike has been an outstanding investigative journalist from the United States, and he has written a brick. This is the brick. This is essential reading for all people who are interested in the topic of 9/11. Whether you agree with him or not is not the matter. There are some flaws in this book, but it's still a great book, and you should read it. It's actually part of the business library in Harvard University. And why did they do it? Because Mike had explained how the global drug traffic actually works in an excellent way. And he looks at it from an economical perspective. And now, without any further ado, I will begin my presentation. Okay, I gave it some thought how I should start this presentation, and ultimately I come up with the conclusion that I should start with again. I should start with the death of money. Okay, when you take a look at the subject of 9/11 or alleged 9/11 insider trading, prior to the attacks of 9/11, you will come to the result that the 9/11 Commission stated it never took place. And so says also the US Securities and Exchange Commission. Yet two high-profile players from Wall Street state on the record that it took place. One of them is Jim Rickards, a hedge fund manager and best-selling author of Currency Wars, and his latest book is The Death of Money. The subtitle is The Coming Collapse of the International Monetary System. And I will begin now with a quote from that book that will tell you something what Jim actually has to do with the 9/11 insider trading. Because, here's a quote, "The secure meeting rooms at the CIA's Langley headquarters, windowless, quiet, and cramped, are called vaults by those who use them. On September 26, 2003, John Mulheron and I were seated side by side in a fourth-floor vault in the headquarters complex. Mulheron was one of the most legendary stock traders in Wall Street history. I was responsible, and now pay attention, I was responsible for modeling terrorist trading for the CIA, part of a broad inquiry into stock trading on advanced knowledge of the 9/11 attacks. I looked in his eyes and asked if he believed there was insider trading in American airline stocks immediately prior to 9/11. His answer was chilling. It was the most blatant case of insider trading I've ever seen." And Jim also agrees that there was insider trading prior to 9/11 related to those attacks by those who had foreknowledge of the attacks. Now, before we go deeper into the book, let us take a look at an interview that Max Kaiser conducted with Jim Rickards. However, I should give you some background on Jim, because then you know why it is worthwhile to make an interview with him. I did this on several occasions myself. For example, Jim was involved in the negotiations to release the hostages during the Iran Revolution. You know that the U.S. Embassy was occupied by agitated students who took U.S. citizens as hostages, and he was involved in the negotiations to get them released. Then in 1998, there was a hedge fund called Long-Term Capital Management, and it crashed. And by crashing, it almost brought the global financial system, the Western global financial system, to its knees. And you have to think about it, that a hedge fund can do this. And so it had to be bailed out by the New York Fed and what a senior German banker calls the international financial aristocracy. And the main negotiator between long-term capital management and the New York Fed, respectively the Fed in Washington, was Jim Rickards. Then in 2003 and the upcoming years, he was involved in working for the CIA, as you have just heard. This was the so-called Project Prophecy. And in 2009, Jim organized the first financial war game for the Pentagon. Moreover, Jim is a very well-reputed expert on gold. Whenever Jim talks about gold and you are interested in gold, you should listen. Okay, now we go to this interview in order to get some basic understanding. It's always the same. Some basic understanding of what Jim was working on for the CIA and what he wrote about 9/11 insider trading in his book. Voila.
Your larger point that markets give us price signals, we know that, but how to look behind the price signal and understand exactly what's going on. By the way, this technique, which we explored for the CIA, is a completely normal technique used by hedge funds every day. Now, hedge funds are looking for insider trading around M&A deals. They're looking for a leak. You know, we see this all the time. A stock suddenly soars for no reason. There's no news. Maybe the market's flattened down, but a particular stock goes way up, and everyone said, gee, what's happening with that stock? And then 3 days later, we find out that it's the subject of a takeover that's announced, but clearly the takeovers don't come out of the thin air. They're, you know, lawyers and accountants and experts and managers work on these things for weeks and sometimes months, and that's the inside group. But sometimes the information leaks out, people trade on it, and you see the price action ahead of the announcement. That's exactly what we saw on 9/11. There was massive buying of put options, and of course when you buy a put option, that's a bet that the stock is going to go down. Massive buying of put options on American Airlines and United Airlines in the last several trading days ahead of 9/11. And again, that's been studied extensively, so I don't think there's any question that it was insider trading. I should add, however, that this was insider trading by terrorist associates. I want to be rigorous and scientific about the evidence, but sort of separate this from some of the crazy theories. There are crazy theories out there that, you know, somehow the U.S. government was behind 9/11. That's all nonsense, and again, I want to separate myself from that. But the basic idea that the terrorists and their associates, that network, were engaged, who did know about the attack, were engaged in insider trading ahead of 9/11. That's very clear.
All right. Of course, when you trade options, you have to do it through a broker. We know that from the investigative journalism of Lars Schall, we know from statements from Deutsche Bank here in Europe, that these trades were done at Alex Brown, which is a firm not too far from the CIA, who was run by Buzzy Krongard. When I was working at Alex Brown, he was leading up the firm. He then took a job as the deputy director of the CIA under George Tenet during the events of 9/11. So here you have a firm in Baltimore where the trades were done that was run by the guy who's now the deputy director at the CIA. Your thoughts, your comments?
Well, Buzzy Krongard, former Alex Brown executive, was executive director of the CIA at the time. I haven't looked at all at the Alex Brown trading. To me, it's sort of irrelevant. What I look at is the market as a whole. What we were saying was really coming through the specialists. Now, you're exactly right, Max. I make the point in the book, nobody trades alone. If you're trading with somebody. So what I really focused on is the overall market action, not any particular firm, but could you tell from the price action and the volume and the momentum itself that something was going on at the time? And of course, we reached the conclusion that something was going on, which was obviously this 9/11 attack was about to happen. But I focus a lot on what's called signal amplification. And just to explain that for the viewers, you can have a very small terrorist trade, meaning, you know, a few thousand shares. Well, someone sees that. It doesn't make the person who sees it a terrorist. They're just a specialist or a hedge fund or someone you know, is kind of watching the tape, and they say, you know what, there's no reason for the stock to be going down. There's no reason for anyone to be buying puts. Someone knows something I don't, and they'll buy more puts. That then puts more pressure on the stock. There's more put buying. So by the end of the day, you may have millions of shares that have traded. It doesn't mean all those people are terrorists or insiders. That's actually legitimate trading. If you're watching the tape and you do what I call a piggyback trade on the original trade, that's actually not illegal. And all those people are not terrorists. Only the original trade, in my example, a couple thousand shares would have been the terror trade. The rest of it is piggybacking or signal amplification. But this is where the 9/11 Commission fell down, because when they went back to investigate after the fact, they looked at the big guys. The big guys are invariably not the insider traders. They're not the terrorists. They're the guys piggybacking. You got to go all the way down to that small initial trade to find it, and that's what we did on a multi-year strategic study for the CIA. We basically explained how you could use that forensic technique, that market information, possibly to detect the next spectacular terrorist
Right, you talk
attack.
about signal amplification. When I was talking to Cantor Fitzgerald, brokers and bankers in the days leading up to 9/11, they themselves were buying these airline puts. They told me, based on rumors that were coming out of Alex Brown, associated with Buzzy Krongard. So this looks to me as if CIA insiders knew enough about what was going on, but chose to make money rather than blowing the whistle.
Well, I don't have any evidence of that, Max.
Okay, we will later on talk about the thing that is irrelevant to Jim, even though he has not looked at it. Very scientific behavior. But I want you to pay attention to one fact. When you are in front of court, what is more or less the best kind of evidence you can get? It's eyewitness testimony. Have you just seen eyewitness testimony given by Max Kaiser? Yes, you have. For now, let's take another look at Jim's book regarding the question who did the insider trading a few days before 9/11 took place. He writes, while the operational details of the 9/11 terror attacks were known in advance to only a small cadre of operatives, the coming of an attack on September 11, 2001 was known to a larger circle. This group included immediate associates of the hijackers, housemates, and financial backers, as well as family and friends. Those who learned of the coming attacks of the terrorists told others, and the information spread through a social network in much the same way a video goes viral. Then later on he says, the insider trading was not done by, surprise, surprise, the terrorists themselves, but by parties in their social network. And then he says, a few pages later, it is important to disassociate this insider trading analysis from the so-called 9/11 truth movement, a collective name for groups and individuals who assert conspiracy theories related to the 9/11 attacks. Many of these theorists claim that agencies and officials of the US government were involved in planning the attacks and that the Twin Towers collapsed from pre-positioned explosives and not from the impact of the hijacked planes. This nonsense is a disservice to the memory of those killed or injured in the attacks and in subsequent military responses. The hard evidence that the attacks were planned and executed by Al-Qaeda is irrefutable. The 9/11 Commission report is a monumental and excellent summary, a brilliant work of history, despite the inevitable flaws that arise in such a wide-ranging effort. Furthermore, there is nothing inconsistent between the widely accepted narrative of 9/11 and terrorist insider trading. Given the magnitude of the attack and the imperatives of human nature, such trading should have been expected. The statistical, behavioral, and anecdotal evidence for insider trading are overwhelming. Terrorist insider trading was not a US government plot, but a simple extension of the main terrorist plot. It was despicable yet, in the end, banal. Small-time terrorist associates could not resist betting on a sure thing, and signal amplification took care of the rest. Okay, you also already explained to you what signal amplification is, and I think this is part of the story. Not all who purchased, for example, put options on the airliners were insiders of the attacks themselves. However, in the interview with Max Kaiser, Jim points out that he does some heavy footnoting for his book. He did some very thorough documenting to make his case. However, he mentions 3 times that the insider trading was done by terrorist associates. However, when you go back then to the footnotes, you will realize there is none. So you have to ask yourself, what is the evidence? Is there evidence to make such a claim? I think it is just a claim, and you have to believe it. Therefore, it's more or less an assumption maybe, or an assertion. And it is fair, it is okay, it is legit to make that kind of thing. But I wouldn't call it, as he did it, that he has been rigorous and scientific about the evidence. Moreover, you have to take into consideration, if there was actually evidence for his claim that this was done by terrorist associates, There would be the necessity of prosecuting those responsible for the trading and indirectly for the attacks. They traded, they did not prevent it. So you have to ask yourself then, why isn't it taking place? Have you ever heard that there is such a prosecution of those people? No, you haven't. And if it doesn't take place, why should you or I believe Jim that there is evidence that the insider trading was done by terrorist associates? By the way, with regards to the term terrorist associates, if you look at the history of modern terrorism, you will stumble across the fact that quite often terrorist associates are the people from intelligence services. And I don't say this as a joke, because when you take a look at two major terrorists of the 9/11 attacks, Al-Midar and Al-Hazmi, you will come to the conclusion that their associates were people from intelligence services. For example, Saudi intelligence people, but you will also find people from the CIA. And you will find, for example, the fact that some of the funding that they received, some of the money indirectly, came from the Saudi embassy in Washington, D.C. However, I should say this as an aside. The 9/11 Commission said in its report, and you will find this quote in chapter 5, that they concluded that the funding of the terrorist attacks was of little practical significance. If you want to look into this, what I have just said about Al-Midar and Al-Hazmi, they were sitting on the plane that was hitting the Pentagon. You should pick up the book Disconnecting the Dots by Kevin Fenton. If I would make a list of the best 10 books on 9/11, Kevin Fenton would make that list. And there you should take a very, very thorough look at a man with the name Richard Blee, B-L-E-E. He was the head of the CIA's Bin Laden unit. And I guarantee you, what Jim, the last thing that Jim would you like to do is picking up that book and see what the CIA has done with Al-Midar and Al-Hazmi, because they have protected them. And they have not protected them once, they have not protected them twice. There's irrefutable evidence presented by Kevin Fenton that the CIA protected those two terrorists more than 30 times. So I think you can talk about a pattern here. And you can also look up related to Richard Blee, and he's a real central player in the text of 9/11, what Peter Dale Scott has written about him in his essays. They're publicly available on the internet. Basically, I think we can say so far that Jim Rickards sells the 9/11 story from the point of view of the 9/11 Commission, that Al-Qaeda was responsible for it and solely responsible for it. There was no thing going on that could be called an act of state-sponsored terrorism. In his book, Jim Rickards talks, for example, about Osama bin Laden, and he does so consequently, you could say. But let's have a critical look at it. And somehow, Jim wants to suggest that bin Laden might be one of those insiders who did the trading. Otherwise, I don't know really why he is mentioning him in this context. And he says then that on September 5th, 2001, that this was the day Osama bin Laden learned that the attacks on New York and Washington would take place on 9/11. Now, if you take a look at his footnotes, it's becoming interesting. If you take a look at his footnotes that he presents to his readers, we will find out that he is referring in this case to an article by Elizabeth Bumiller, Bin Laden on tape, boasts on Trade Center attacks, US says it proves his guilt, which was published in the New York Times on December 14th, 2001. You may remember that the Pentagon was releasing the so-called bin Laden confession videotape in December of 2001. However, at that time, and there are various sources for this, but at that time, something was going on in Germany, and I tell you now about it. There's a TV format called Monitor. It's a leftist format, but very well reputed. And the journalists there asked the State Department to get the Arabic text version of the videotapes. And they gave then the transcripts to some Arabic and German linguists and specialists for the Orient. And lo and behold, quote, or I have to read it in German and translate it simultaneously in English. The English translation that was presented by the US government to the world public isn't just partially manipulated, it contains even errors. So if you're really rigorous and scientific about the evidence, I don't know if you would refer to this tape, because it's getting better. This tape did not make any kind of impression on the FBI. You may be aware of the fact that Osama bin Laden was on the most wanted list of the FBI, and they looked out for him, like, for example, related to the embassy bombings in 1998 and the attack on the USS Cole. However, they were not looking for him related to the 9/11 attacks. And then there was a media outlet that asked the press department of the FBI why this is the case. And they said then that there was no hard evidence connecting bin Laden to 9/11. So you have to ask yourself, what is Jim doing here? He's connecting bin Laden somehow with 9/11. What evidence does he have that the FBI did not have? Moreover, when you look it up, there's an interview by Charlie Rose, a very interesting journalist from the United States, with Richard Cheney. And you will find the transcript of that interview on the website of the White House. And in that interview, Dick Cheney says something like, we, he means the US government or the administration of George W. Bush, we never said that bin Laden had anything to do with 9/11. There was no hard evidence surfacing that would say so or indicate so. Again, quite interesting. Another thing, it's just a detail. The Pentagon released that tape in December 2001. In the very same month, the first report was showing up that said that bin Laden was already dead at that time. You can look it up. The report is, headline, report, bin Laden already dead, published at Fox News on the 26th of December 2001. I have seen it, it's still online, and later on there was another interesting report on this coming up on October 16th, 2002, which said in its headline, Israeli intelligence, bin Laden is dead, hair has been chosen. And you can find it on World Tribune. So this is quite interesting, I think. Okay, what do I do now? Jim then says something about that bin Laden was, quote, financially sophisticated. And he shows it, or tries to show it, with an excerpt from an interview that was released or published in October 2001 by a fella with the name of Taiza Aluni. He was working for Al Jazeera. And the interview is headlined, A Discussion on the New Crusader Wars, and was published on October 21, 2001. When you take a look at what he is quoting, actually it doesn't say anything about bin Laden being financially sophisticated. It just shows you that bin Laden was able to read a newspaper and to listen to the news on the radio and understand it. Because at this time in October 2001, it was already clear that there was major damage done to the US economy. And this is what he's talking about, but he didn't have to come up with some financial sophistication in order to say such things. The interview, however, if you go back and read it, is interesting because bin Laden never ever says anything to the effect that I was connected with the 9/11 attacks, directly or indirectly. And this shouldn't come as a surprise because where are my specific notes on this? I'm sorry. Because already in on September 17th, 2001, CNN ran a story that said in its headline, bin Laden says he wasn't behind attacks. Have you ever heard about this? No. And why? Maybe because CNN was later on in December pushing the bin Laden confession tape story. Moreover, there is an interview that I have translated from English into German. You can find it under the headline Osama bin Laden in seinen eigenen Worten, which means Osama bin Laden in his own words. This was an interview that was conducted for a Pakistani newspaper called Ummat, U-M-M-A-T. And it was published in September and was then translated after it was confirmed that the interview is authentic by BBC World Monitoring Services and then published on September 29, 2001. And in this interview, Osama bin Laden says, well, he has maybe nothing against the attacks as such that they occurred, but he denies that he himself and Al-Qaeda had anything to do with it. And I published it then in 2011 because there was no translation into German, and I thought it's quite interesting that he makes such statements and there's no translation in German. And I'm pretty confident that there's no translation into your language as well. Okay, so these are some facts on Osama bin Laden that very little attention is paid to. Now we come to Al-Qaeda as such. I have now some excerpts from a movie that was produced and filmed by a fella with the name of Adnan Suberi. He lives in Toronto, Canada, and he made a very excellent movie. The movie is called 9/11 in the Academic Community. And usually I do not endorse any kind of movies related to 9/11. I have seen a lot of them and I think most of them are crap. However, in this case, I wholeheartedly endorse this movie. You should get a copy on DVD. And I did an interview with Adnan that you can find under the headline, The Sound of Silence in Academia Connected to 9/11. And in it, Adnan says, critical perspectives on 9/11 are systemically excluded from universities. And I have experienced this myself as a student in university. And I just want to read one endorsement because it's coming from a very interesting fella. And this is Friedrich Steinhäusler, professor of physics at Salzburg University, Salzburg in Austria. And he was the former co-director of the NATO Advanced Research Workshop on Catastrophic Terrorism, and he was the chairman of the US-German Transatlantic Expert Group on Terrorism. And he says about Adnan's movie, I hope that this material will be made available to the wider international academic community in order to foster a wider fact-based discussion among researchers and students alike. Now, talking about facts, we will see now some statements by Michael Truscello or Truscello, I don't know how to pronounce his name, and he will now tell you what the interpretation of Al-Qaeda is given by the 9/11 Commission report, and then he does some reality check. Okay.
There is a concerted effort to depict Al-Qaeda as what they call a substantial worldwide organization. So for example, the 9/11 Commission report describes Al-Qaeda in the following way. On page 67, they write, "The inner core of Al-Qaeda continued to be a hierarchical, top-down group with defined positions, tasks, and salaries." Okay, so it sounds very much like your average corporation. However, as the former CIA executive director, Buzzy Krongard, revealed to Salon.com in 2007, Al-Qaeda, in his opinion, is, quote, an amalgamation, a loose amalgamation of people who share an antipathy to the United States and all Western values. Some of them hate each other, some of them get along, some of them are very, very small splinter groups, but it's not like IBM, with an organizational chart, with black lines and chains of command and things like that. So there you have someone from the inside of the national security state in the United States contradicting quite explicitly what the 9/11 Commission report tells us. Others, academics, have sort of reiterated this. Professor Andrew Silke, for example, the director of terrorism studies at the University of East London, has said, and I'll quote directly again, "To begin with, Al-Qaeda is not a traditional terrorist organization. It does not have a clear hierarchy, military mindset, and centralized command. At best, Al-Qaeda is a network of affiliated groups sharing religious and ideological backgrounds, but which often interact sparingly." So why, I guess we have to ask, would the 9/11 Commission go to such great lengths to portray Al-Qaeda as this worldwide organization in dozens of countries with salaried positions, when top intelligence experts and top academics in the field of terrorism studies tell us that, in fact, the opposite is true?
The opposite is true. Then I have another excerpt from this movie, and there you cannot actually see because there was a technical fault appearing when I did the copy of the original DVD, and exactly the parts that I wanted to show you, there was no image, I just have the audio. So we just can listen to it. But imagine we would have the image but no sound. I think it would be a worse situation. Okay, first comes Graham McQueen. And by the way, I should say that he has just published a book on the anthrax letter attacks in 2001, which of course have to be seen in the larger context of 9/11 and the climate it created. And it happened that I talked with Neil Sarrett about this book yesterday, and he said, "Oh, I just bought a copy, you know." So this is the book, and I also think that you should buy it. The 2001 Anthrax Deception, The Case for a Domestic Conspiracy by Graham McQueen. And here's a nice endorsement. "This deeply troubling book should be read by all thinking Americans." And so says Dennis J. Halliday, UN Assistant Secretary General from 1994 to 98. And they are talking now. First comes Graham McQueen, then comes Michael Truscello, and then again Graham McQueen. They are talking about Al-Qaeda and the so-called Al-Qaeda plot to commit 9/11. We are talking here about evidence, and now listen.
So we're reading the 9/11 Commission report, and we find a footnote. There's a forest of footnotes. This is why it looks like scholarship. It's big and heavy. It's got little print. It's got a lot of footnotes, and they're in even smaller print. So it's made to look like an academic work. So you say, well, that's interesting.
One study revealed that 25% of the footnotes in the 9/11 Commission report are based on tortured testimony. It's even more condensed when you consider that most of that tortured testimony belongs to chapters 5 and 7 of the report, which deal with the alleged Al-Qaeda plot. On page 146 of the 9/11 Commission report, the commissioners admit that they were not allowed to meet with the alleged Al-Qaeda detainees. They were not allowed to submit questions to the detainees. They were not even allowed to submit questions to the alleged interrogators. They were told that it would interrupt the interrogation process, a process which we now know had consisted of 183 waterboardings in 1 month.
They even admit, they give one little part of the page in which they say, well, you know, a lot of what we've based on here is from people held in detention. We can't be sure that this is accurate. We weren't allowed to interview them or talk to these detainees. Weren't even allowed to talk to the people who interrogated them. So it's kind of secondhand, but we decided, you know, to go ahead. They didn't just go ahead, they made it the core of their story. And they don't discuss there the fact that these guys were tortured. In the case of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, something like 190 times he was waterboarded, or that he was told his son might be killed, you know, and all these kinds of things. He later told the ICRC, the Red Cross, that he'd made stuff up. Well, of course you'd make stuff up. They don't discuss that. They don't discuss the moral implications, the epistemological implications. What does it mean to base a story on that kind of testimony? It's absurd.
As you have just heard, Michael Schall said, according to one study, approximately 25% of all footnotes in the 9/11 Commission report are based on torture testimony. So this is 1/4, and I think it's quite substantial. Then I also talked about this topic with Peter Dale Scott, a former professor for English and one of the most outstanding political researchers that we have on this planet. I also talked with him about this topic, and you will find the interview. It's an audio interview, but I also did a transcript in English under the headline, "Let's talk about the American deep state," because basically the best expert for the American deep state you can talk with is Peter Dale Scott. The official version of 9/11 is based in very large parts on torture testimony. Does this make the story pretty much worthless? And furthermore, is this something that too many people are ignorant of?
The 9/11 Commission report, that it's only one small part of the report, but the part that is talking about what Al-Qaeda did, how they planned it, and so on. Yes, that is all from tortured testimony, from people who were being tortured before they gave this testimony. Some of those witnesses, now no longer in custody, have recanted what they said. They put in about one person, Abu Zubaydah. He confessed to being a part of the Al-Qaeda thing, and he wasn't at all. It was a total misguided direction. So I think all of that testimony should be thrown out. That wouldn't invalidate the whole of the 9/11 Commission report, but certain chapters of it, which are talking about what Al-Qaeda did, yes, are not to be taken very seriously because of their reliance. By the way, you know, the 9/11 Commission wanted to see the transcripts. We're not allowed to see the transcripts. Right away, that becomes very suspicious. They were not told that the people were tortured. And since then, I think both of the co-chairmen, Thomas Keane and Hamilton, have complained that they were actually misled by the CIA. And so that it's in a bit of a shambles, the official version that's in the 9/11 Commission report. It's being discounted even by the co-chairman of the commission. But yes, the fact that they used torture to obtain testimony should not have happened in the first place. It should not have been used in the second place. They should have been candid about the circumstances, and they weren't in the third places. So in every way, it is a disgrace.
By the way, the videotapes from which the transcripts were taken, as far as I know, and again, don't take anything that I say at face value, those tapes were destroyed. It's always very suspicious if you destroy evidence, but you can look for it. So all in all, I think it's fair to say that it's in a bit of a shambles when it comes to Jim Rickards' statements that, I quote from his book, "The 9/11 Commission report is a monumental and excellent summary, a brilliant work of history." If you want to read something about the Commission, I would say you should read The Commission, The Uncensored History of 9/11 Investigation by Philip Shannon. He is a journalist for the New York Times, and for the New York Times he covered all the things related to the 9/11 Commission. It has its limits, but it also has its merits. And for example, what I would like to encourage you to take a look at very thoroughly is the work that Philip Zelikow, the executive director of the 9/11 Commission, did with the historian Ernest May from Harvard University. Then you will know how the report was actually written, and I think that's quite interesting. We will come later back to Jim's claim that he himself has been rigorous and scientific about the evidence. In the meantime, I want to talk about two important topics, because when you read the first chapter by Jim Rickards, he tries to create the impression that there's the CIA and here is Wall Street, and both things have nothing to do with each other. I think this is very, very wrong. And I will read now something from the book that I'm writing in German. So again, I have to read it in German and simultaneously translate it into English. Let's see how this works out. The predecessor of the CIA, the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, was created during World War II with the help by senior personnel from the Wall Street investment bank Dillon Read. Its headquarters was based in the financial district of New York. The first head of the OSS was William Joseph Donovan, who was one of the founders of a law firm on Wall Street that is still existing today, Donovan, Leisure, Newton, and Irvine. After World War II, from 1945 till 1947, there was a smaller version of the OSS existing called Central Intelligence Group, which was part of the State Department of the US and was headed by a general with the name H.S. Vandenberg. However, I'm not sure if you are familiar with the so-called War and Peace studies. Have you ever heard about them? They were carried out by the Council on Foreign Relations and the State Department even before the United States entered the Second World War in 1939, and the War and Peace studies were funded by the Rockefeller Fund. And they were actually looking what are our aims in the upcoming war? There will be a war, and what will we do afterwards? And what you will almost never hear, for example, is how the Bretton Woods system was already designed in those War and Peace studies. They already had the plan for the IMF and the World Bank. And then the Bretton Woods, the famous Bretton Woods conference, was taking place later on. And you should take a look at what they meant with the so-called Grand Area strategy. Be it as it may, they needed a much larger intelligence service after World War II. And now we see again some close relations between Wall Street and what became then the CIA. Because related to the national security that created the CIA on July 26, 1947, Professor Peter Dale Scott writes about the role that Allen Dulles had in this. As CIA Director Richard Helms narrates in his memoirs, Alan Dulles, who was a Wall Street lawyer at that time, was recruited in 1946 to draft proposals for the shape and organization of what was to become the Central Intelligence Agency in 1947. Dulles promptly formed an advisory group of 6 men, all but one of whom were Wall Street investment bankers or lawyers. In 1948, Forrestal, he means the Secretary of Defense at that time in 1948, but Mr. Forrestal has worked for Dillon Read, respectively William A. Read, what then later became Dillon Read on Wall Street. In 1948, Forrestal appointed Dulles chairman of a committee along with 2 other New York lawyers to review CIA's performance. The 3 lawyers conferred for close to a year in one of the boardrooms of J.H. Whitney, another Wall Street investment firm. Another man from Wall Street that you should take a look at is Ferdinand Eberstadt, who was also an investment banker and quite important for the development of the CIA at that time. One fact, in the first 2 decades of its existence, all 7 of the known deputy directors of the CIA came from the same circles of Wall Street lawyers and bankers. 6 of them were, in addition, listed in the New York Social Register. The New York Social Register is basically a register for the upper 10,000s, so high society, you could say. And now a close look, when you take a close look at the senior personnel at the CIA, you will stumble across the following. First of all, the National Security Act was actually written by Clark Clifford. Have you ever heard about Clark Clifford? Do you know anything about him? He was advisor to Harry S. Truman, president at that time, and he was the Secretary of Defense of the US under Lyndon B. Johnson. Now, what was his profession? Wall Street lawyer and banker. When he was writing the national security draft, he worked closely together with Alan Dulles, the brother of John Foster Dulles. Have you ever heard about the Dulles brothers? They were partners in the most influential law firm on Wall Street that is still existing today, Sullivan and Cromwell. Then a very important branch within CIA at the beginning, in the early stages, was the Office of Policy Coordination. The first head of the OPC had the name Frank Wisner. What was the profession of Frank Wisner? Wall Street lawyer. Another important man in the history of the CIA was William Casey. He was the director of the Central Intelligence under Ronald Reagan. When Richard Nixon was president, he was working at the Securities and Exchange Commission. And do you have already a feeling what his profession could have been? He was a Wall Street lawyer and a stock trader. When William Casey was the director of the CIA, the general counsel of the CIA was Stanley Sporkin, who was later on for 20 years in a senior position at the SEC. What was the profession of Stanley Sporkin? Wall Street lawyer at the law firm of Weil, Gotshal and Mangus. His successor as general counsel of the CIA was David Doherty, who later went on to work at the New York Stock Exchange, where he was the executive vice president. John Deutsch, CIA director from 1995 until 1996, was going directly from the CIA into the board of Citigroup, the second largest bank of the US. There also worked Nora Sletkin, who was formerly executive director of the CIA. And before he worked at the CIA from 2001 until 2004, and you have already heard about him, A.B. Buzzy Krongard worked in the board of the Bankers Trust, and he has been chairman of the investment bank Alex Brown, which is the oldest investment bank of the United States. So lots of people talk about a revolving door between Wall Street and the US Treasury. I think it's safe to say that you can see that there's a revolving door also between Wall Street and the CIA as well, but one about which there's much lesser talk going on, and it's much older, this relationship, I think. And in my book, I then talk about two examples where you can really see the close relationship between CIA and Wall Street interests. The one example is the coup d'etat in Iran in 1953. It's often referred to as a CIA coup, but actually you could also say it was a coup undertaken by the oil majors, and the CIA was just the muscle to carry it out. And another one is the case of Promise. Have you ever heard about Promise software? You should take a look at it because it shows you how vast a conspiracy can really be. And I tell you some basic facts about this. You can look it up online under the headline "Follow the Money, the NSA's Real-Time Electronics Surveillance of Bank Transactions." Because basically, at the end of the 1970s, beginning of the 1980s, there was a firm called Inslaw in Maryland, I think, or nearby Washington. And the head of this firm until today is William Hamilton. And they developed a very, very sophisticated piece of data mining software. And basically, he was creating this software for the US Justice Department. However, the Justice Department saw the software, thought, wow, this is great stuff. Why don't we just steal it? And they stole it. And they never paid William. They actually drove him into bankruptcy so that he couldn't defend himself very effectively. However, he later on had a lawyer who was fighting the US Justice Department, and he himself was formerly the head of the US Justice Department a decade earlier, so that's quite ironic. I want to tell you the following, and I think it tells you something about today's world. If you know the story of Promise, you wouldn't be surprised in any way about any of the revelations coming through the name of Edward Snowden. And because I published a transcript of a PBS, public broadcasting system in the US, documentary on the NSA Follow the Money project in the second half of the 1980s, in which former Reagan White House National Security Council staff told about this NSA mission. And Promise stands for the Prosecutor's Management Information System. And as I have told you, it was originally developed by William A. Hamilton's software firm Inslaw for the US Justice Department. However, according to Guy Lawson's book Octopus, that sophisticated piece of software had been so successful that the American intelligence apparatus had secretly stolen the software to put it to use covertly. The CIA had reconfigured the code and installed it in 32-bit Digital Equipment Corporation VAX mini-computers. The agency had used front companies to sell the new technology to banks and leading financial institutions like the Federal Reserve. Hidden inside the computer was a trapdoor that enabled intelligence agencies to covertly monitor financial transactions digitally for the first time. The highly classified initiative known as Follow the Money had allowed the Reagan administration to trace, for example, the Libyan government's secret funding of a terrorist group that had bombed a disco in Berlin in 1986, and then the attack was going on Tripolis. Now, again, I remind you, here you have some funding of a terrorist attack that was taking place in Berlin in the 1980s. However, the 9/11 Commission said about the funding of the 9/11 attacks, ultimately it was of little practical significance. Bob Woodward, you know about him, related to Watergate. He tells in one of his books that former CIA Director William Casey said that the secret money tracking system had been one of his proudest achievements. And in this PBS documentation, you will see Dr. Norman Bailey, who was in the 1980s in the Reagan administration, the director of plans of the National Security State, of the Security Council of the United States. And for example, what was done, the PROMIS software was used to monitor CHIPS, the clearinghouse interbank clearing system. You will hear later on about this in New York City, which reportedly records payments and settlements for foreign trade, foreign exchange, and syndicated loans for its 139 member banks in 35 countries. The Reagan NSC, National Security Council staff members, especially Dr. Norman Bailey, are widely credited with the creation of the Follow the Money SIGINT mission for NSA, Signal Intelligence, SIGINT. They provided considerable details in the PBS documentary, extraordinary for a SIGINT project. I mean, compared today, when you read those transcripts, it's a whole different story how they handle such things today. And there's no doubt about this, that this was actually taking place. And the Reagan NSC also later sought a legal opinion for a major expansion in 1986 of NSA's Follow the Money bank surveillance project to add approximately 400 major commercial banks that comprised the interbank system. There were also published reports about US intelligence installation of PROMIS in international financial institutions, including the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, and the World Bank in Washington, D.C. And you should look at an interview that Dr. Bailey gave to Zalan.com, respectively to Tim Shorrock, and the headline is Exposing Bush's Historic Abuse of Power. Now, we have to take into consideration that the PROMIS software during the 1980s and the 1990s was sold in a covert way by an old boys network of the CIA, the so-called Octopus. And there's one feature of this software, or how it was used, that's very interesting, and we now hear Mike Rupert talking about this in a documentary that I made entitled Terror Trading 9/11. And listen now closely.
And another story that you write about is PROMIS. It's a software by which the intelligence agencies monitor the stock market in real time. Why is this of importance here?
Well, the PROMIS has a very long, deep, and bloody history with a great many dead bodies along the way, and it had been a subject for journalists prior to 9/11. But what was clear right after the attacks of 9/11 was that PROMIS was involved, as evidenced by stories in major news organizations from Fox to whatever. PROMIS allows real-time monitoring of stock transactions anywhere in the world It's been mated with artificial intelligence, and it is a software which throughout the course of the 80s and the 90s was modified by U.S. and Israeli intelligence to include backdoors that allowed the people who provided the software, whether it be to banks or whatever, to quietly go inside and look at everything that was taking place and actually to manipulate data inside any database where it had been installed.
So I think this is an important fact, that it was or is used to track the global stock market trade in real time. And this is relevant to all that happened in connection with the never completely cleared up transaction that occurred just before September 11, and of which the former chairman of the Deutsche Bundesbank, this is the central bank of Germany, Ernst Welteke, said that it could not have been planned and carried out without a certain knowledge. Okay, so the vehicle, or before I continue, there is further research material. These are two books that I have read about it, and you should especially pick up the book by Miss Seymour and get the story of Danny Casolaro. He was an investigative journalist who was murdered because of his investigation into Promise. Okay, the vehicle for the insider trading was mainly, not only, but mainly via put and call options. And I thought, well, how can I explain it to you? I think I explain it to you by reading something. I read from a book that was published last year, The Misunderstood Crisis, It's the Energy Stupid, by two fellas from the Netherlands that I'm personally in touch with, Oscar Slingerland and Martin van Moerik. They are oil analysts, and in 2006, they already knew, by just looking at production data and investment that was going on in the oil markets or related to the oil companies, that there was only just one possibility, and that was that the oil price would rise in 2007 and 2008 to new record highs, and so it did. In summer of 2008, the oil price reached the record price of $147. And in September 2006, they concluded that they should profit from their knowledge on the oil market. And they was giving a thought how they do it. Well, maybe we go to the futures market. No, it's a little bit too risky. We go to the option markets. And now listen. Exactly as in the stock markets, option contracts are also available for trade in the oil markets. You can buy or sell options on WTI, this is Western Texas Intermediate, and or Brent futures contracts, and the option contract is relatively simple. In return for paying an option premium, you get the option to buy oil, a call option, or sell oil, a put option, at predefined prices in the futures. As the name suggests, you have the option to make these deals rather than the obligation. So if you've bought a call option and the market rises, exceeding the predefined benchmark price, you can then exercise the option, buy the oil at that price, and sell it at the new high, pocketing a healthy profit. If, on the contrary, the price falls, you only stand to lose the premium you paid. Unlike the futures contract, you're not obliged to take delivery of the oil. As implied by the fact that you can buy options, the market also involves sellers of options. The seller of an option, call option, will commit to supply the oil if you exercise your option right, while the seller of a put option commits to buying the oil if you choose to exercise the option, i.e., use your right to sell. As to whether the call option seller is actually in possession of any oil when he sells the call, that isn't certain, and it isn't a requirement for the initial transaction to take place. He'll have time later on to buy the necessary goods. But if he doesn't own the oil, he'll run the risk of losing money if the price is higher at the end of the contract term. And it goes on a little bit like this, but basically you know now that when you buy a call option, you have the expectation that the underlying price of the stock will rise. And when you buy a put option, it's the opposite is the case. Okay. And now I will tell you a little bit about those put options. As you have seen, Max Kaiser. Max Kaiser has been a stock and options trader on Wall Street himself during the 1980s and the 1990s. And I've talked with him quite often about the insider trading. And in this context, he pointed out to me that he had spoken with many brokers in the towers of the World Trade Center around that time. I heard firsthand about the airline put trade from brokers at Cantor Fitzgerald days before. Cantor Fitzgerald is a very major broker of bonds in the United States. It handles about roughly 50% of the United States bonds. And you have heard about this in the interview. And he said then, there are many aspects concerning these option purchases that have not been disclosed yet. I also worked at Alex Brown and Sons, ABS. Deutsche Bank bought Alex Brown and Sons in 1999. When the attacks occurred, ABS was owned by Deutsche Bank, and an important person at ABS was Buzzy Krongard. I have met him several times at the offices in Baltimore. Krongard had transferred to become executive director at the CIA. The option purchases in which ABS was involved occurred in the offices of ABS in Baltimore. The noise which occurred between Baltimore, New York City, and Langley, which is where the CIA is headquartered, was interesting, as you can imagine, to say the least. Under consideration here is the fact that Alex Brown, a subsidiary of Deutsche Bank, traded massive put option purchases on United Airlines Company through the Chicago Board Option Exchange, CBOE. And now quote, to the embarrassment of investigators, as the British newspaper The Independent reported. That report in 2001 was written by a fellow with the name Chris Blackhurst. I have written him in a press inquiry. I wanted to know something about his report. However, Mr. Blackhurst is now the chief editor of the Independent, and I guess he is so occupied with this task that he couldn't respond to my press inquiry at all. Then there was another thing going on at Alex Brown that is quite interesting. On September 12th, the chairman of the board of Deutsche Bank, Alex Brown, Mario A. Shatuk III, suddenly and quietly renounced his post, although he still had a 3-year contract with an annual salary of several million US dollars. Isn't it a little bit strange? Have you heard about that any other CEO stepped back from his post because maybe he was so depressed, or this was so depressing, this event, I have to step back from my post and make 1.5 year maybe holiday, and you know, that would be maybe the reasoning. However, I also tried to get an answer from this man, and so I have to see where it is. I'm sorry, but yeah, there it is. You can find this under the headline 9/11 currency joins insider trading claims at Asia Times Online, where I have written about this. And I tried to get in touch with him through the firm that he is now working and through the press department, and I wanted to know some of the things. Basically I wanted to know, why have you stepped back from your post? Have you an idea what the response was? 0. A few weeks later, the press spokesperson of the CIA, of the Central Intelligence Agency at that time, Tom Crispell, declined all comments when he was contacted for a report for Rupert's website From the Wilderness, and had been asked, quote, whether the Treasury Department or FBI had questioned CIA Executive Director and former Deutsche Bank Alex Brown CEO, A.B. Buzzy Krongard, about CIA monitoring of financial markets using PROMIS and his former position as of overseer of Brown's private client relations. The guy who was responsible that A.B. Buzzy Krongard was transferred to the CIA was CIA chief George Tenet himself. He writes so in his book. And Krongard supervised mainly private client banking at Alex Brown. In any case, after 9/11, on the first trading day, when the US stock markets were open again, the stock price of United Airlines declined by 43%. With his background as a former options trader, Kaiser explained an important issue to me in that regard. Put options are, if they are employed in a speculative trade, basically bets that stock prices will drop abruptly. The purchaser, who enters a time-specific contract with the seller, does not have to own the stock at the time when the contract is purchased. Related to the issue of insider trading via put or call options, there's also a noteworthy definition by the Swiss economists Remo Crameri, Mark Chesney, and Loriani Mancini, notably that an option trade may be identified as informed, but is not yet legally proven. This is important. Is not yet legally proven when it is characterized by an unusual large increment in open interest and volume, induces large gains, and is not hedged in the stock market. Now, open interest describes contracts which have not been settled, have not been exercised by the end of the trading session at the stock exchange, but are still open. Not hedged in the stock market means that the buyer of a put or call option holds no shares of the underlying asset, by which he might be able to mitigate or compensate losses if his trade doesn't work out. Or phrased differently, one does not hedge because it is unnecessary, since you know that you will be successful with your bet. And it's not really a bet in this case because the result is not uncertain, but a foregone conclusion. Okay, and so it's quite interesting to see this happening at Alex Brown, and this is what Jim Rickards says to you, and I don't know if you have the same feeling, is irrelevant. Do you think this is irrelevant? I don't think it is irrelevant that no government agency of the United States has ever asked about this. This is not irrelevant. Okay, another thing that it is important to know is that the brokers usually have to buy options through a broker, and the broker knows the two sides of the transaction. He knows the buyer and the seller. So if you really want to go back to the insider trading, you would need to take a look at the buyer, and then you know it. Of course, there are tactics to veil your tracks. So that's not too obviously, but in the end it should be possible to track down those who were responsible for the insider trading. And immediately after 9/11, there were articles published in in the mainstream financial press about the alleged insider trading. And in early 2001, the US Securities and Exchange Commission began a probe into certain stock market transactions around 9/11 that included 38 companies, among them American Airlines, United Airlines, Continental Airlines, Northwest Airlines, Southwest Airlines, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, American Express, American International Group, AIG, AXA in France, Bank of America, Bank of New York, Bear Stearns, Citigroup, Lehman Brothers, Morgan Stanley, General Motors, and Raytheon. Okay, but in the very same month, there was happening something very unusual by the SEC, because it deputized hundreds, if not even thousands, of key stakeholders in the private sector for their investigation. In a statement that was sent to almost all listed companies in the US, the SEC asked the addressed companies to assign senior staff for the investigation who would be aware of the sensitive nature of the case and could be relied on to exercise appropriate discretion. In essence, it was about controlling information when you deputize someone, because this has compromising consequences. And in his book, Mike Ruppert writes, what happens when you deputize someone in a national security or criminal investigation is that you make it illegally for them to disclose publicly what they know. When you ask yourself why is nobody stepping forward and talking about the insider trading, maybe you already have now the answer. Smart move. In effect, they become government agents and are controlled by government regulations rather than their own conscience. In fact, they can be thrown into jail without a hearing if they talk publicly. I have seen this implied threat time after time with federal investigators, intelligence agents, and even members of the United States Congress who are bound to... When should I stop?
When it's on 0.
Okay. Okay, then I have now to... Well, what can I do now? I have too much material. Okay, now I have to make up my mind how I will proceed. I would encourage you to take a look at the interview that I did with Professor Paul Zaremka, who is an economist from the State University of New York. He's one of the very few, maybe the only one, I think so, the only real economist who is talking about scientific papers that are talking about the insider trading. And these are the 3 scientific studies that you should take a look at. The interesting thing related to the paper by Professor Potesman from the University of, Champaign in Illinois, he had the actual trading data from the Chicago Board Option Exchange. This is an advantage that he has compared with everyone else. I've talked, for example, with Mark Chesney, and we have become friends, from the University of Zurich. He promised me, for example, when this paper is finally published in a peer-reviewed journal, that he will give me an interview related to the topic. But on the phone, he already told me that they would need much better trading, the actual trading data, but they don't get it. For example, they asked the French stock exchange to get the trading data. They don't get it. Okay. However, there's one thing that I really want to tell you about the claim by Jim Rickards that he has been rigorous and scientific about the evidence. Because in the second paper, Detecting Informed Trading Activities in the Option Markets, Professor Chesney and his colleagues are talking about insider trading via options, not just for the 2 airliners. Jim Rickards is talking about the two airlines and only about the two airlines. It gives you a very wrong perception of the thing. Of course, he then is in the footnotes. You will find those papers, the other two papers, besides the one by Professor Potesman. However, he does not present the evidence of those papers. And now imagine you are a reader of his book. You will read the main body of the book, but you will, or very few people will actually take a look at the papers themselves. And in the paper by Professor Chesney, they have the evidence that there was insider trading going on, not just in the two airlines, the two airline companies, but for example, in Boeing, in 5 major banks of the US, and in the reinsurers of the WTC buildings, Munich Re and Swiss Re. So this is maybe a complete different story, that there was insider trading going on in much more companies than just in the two airlines. Is this maybe a complete different story if I make the impression that, okay, we can talk about the two airlines, but everything else I withhold from the public, more or less. And he never addresses the third paper. He has it in its footnotes, but he doesn't talk about it because it is a contradiction to his selling point that there was insider trading going on in the two airlines, because those guys are talking about option purchases related to the S&P 500. The S&P 500 is an index in the United States that lists the biggest 500 companies in the United States. And so the rationale was for the insiders in that case that the attacks would have devastating effects on the whole of the economy and not just the two airlines. And what I believe Jim is engaged in is a so-called limited hangout. Have you ever heard about a limited hangout? It is a technique in public relations, respectively propaganda, which is basically the same if you go back to the father of public relations, Edward Bernays. And imagine there is something that is really controversial, that you don't want anybody to talk about. It's something hidden, it's something secret, yet more and more people talk about it. And then someone with authority steps forward and says, well, yeah, there is some truth to it. There were two airliners in which there was put option purchases going on. However, the tactic is to omit a small part of the story and keep the nasty details hidden. So you see 1/10 of the iceberg, and the 9/10 of the iceberg are kept hidden. That is a limited hangout. And with his background that he worked for the CIA and for the Pentagon, what do you actually expect what he gives you? He gives you a bone for the dog. Here, play with it. But that's about it. Moreover, he does not talk about that there's a likelihood that there were also one case of insider trading going on with the stock of Raytheon, one of the biggest manufacturers of weapon systems. Raytheon is the company that builds Tomahawk missiles, for example, that were used in October of 2001 in Afghanistan. And someone bought, or many people bought options, call options, with the expectation that the attacks would trigger a rise of the stock of Raytheon, as it did. Unfortunately, I cannot talk about other things here, for example, but I encourage you to take a look at it. In June 2001 and August 2001, there was a very, very substantial increase in money in circulation outside of the banking system in the United States. I have talked with a former financial analyst of the Federal Reserve in Chicago about it. he has blown the whistle about it, and he has lost his job because of it. I have talked with him about it. You can find the interview, I believe, under the headline, how does dirty money become clean money? Because he is an expert for money laundering, and he can explain to you how money is laundered. This is, I've looked out for experts on this topic, and the only one I could find who was willing to talk with me about this was William Berkman, and then I talked also about this related to the Federal Reserve. And by the way, I also have written about this to the press secretary of the Federal Reserve in Washington and of the Federal Reserve, the regional bank in New York, because most of this increase occurred at the Federal Reserve of New York. I can show you a graph about this. I'm sorry that I cannot show you everything that I have prepared, but here is a graph that I have shown to the Federal Reserve of New York. What do you think the response was? Again, 0. Also, I have the SEC concluded that the insider trading never took place. However, some documents related to this case, someone wanted to see this through a Freedom of Information Act inquiry, and he was given the answer that that evidence that he was looking for was destroyed. Again, highly suspicious, destruction of evidence. I have asked the SEC about it. I came along with those 3 scientific papers that are contradicting the version of the 9/11 Commission. You can find their judgment about the 9/11 insider trading in the chapter 5 and in the footnote of 130. And the SEC also never answered to me. One last point I would like to make is I think Jim does not really do an honest job. However, the chapter 1 that I have I have read from, is not completely useless. That's not the case. This is not what I want to say, and the book is very useful. It will prepare you if you want to buy it for the future. Thank you very much.